It was one of those nights when the city seemed to have forgotten what warmth meant. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the sound of hurried footsteps and indifferent lives. Under a flickering streetlight, a young woman sat on the cold pavement, her trembling hands wrapped tightly around a small bundle of blankets that moved softly in her arms. Her name was Daphne. 26 years old, beautiful in a quiet, fragile way, the kind of beauty that hardship couldn't erase, only deepen. And inside that bundle was her 5-year-old daughter, Ellie, pale, coughing, and shivering from the freezing air that crept into her tiny bones. Daphne looked up at the passing people. Men in suits, women with shopping bags, teenagers laughing, couples holding hands. All of them moving faster the closer they came to her. She whispered, her voice barely audible, "Please, my daughter. She's sick. We just need a little help." But no one stopped. Some turned their eyes away. Others tightened their coats as if her suffering might be contagious. The light above her buzzed, casting a pale yellow glow on her tear-streaked face. Her lips were cracked, her hair tangled from days without rest. Ellie whimpered softly, her small hand clutching her mother's coat. Daphne pressed her daughter closer, her heart breaking with every breath that sounded weaker than the last. For weeks, she had tried to find work. She had walked into restaurants, grocery stores, even cleaning companies. All had turned her away. "We're not hiring," they said, or worse. They just looked at her clothes and smiled politely before asking her to leave. The little money she had saved was gone, spent on food for Ellie and the cheapest room she could find. When that ran out, the streets became their only home. Now, under the bitter winter sky, she could feel her strength fading. She had never felt so helpless. A mother was supposed to protect her child. But how do you protect someone when you can't even keep them warm? Daphne brushed her thumb over Ellie's cheek, whispering softly, "Mommy's here, sweetheart. Mommy's here." The little girl's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever. "Mommy, I'm cold," she murmured, her voice trembling. Daphne bit her lip to keep from crying. "I know, baby, I know." She looked up again, desperate now, her voice cracking as she called out to a man walking by. "Sir, please, my daughter is sick. I just need help getting her warm. Please." The man hesitated for half a second, then shook his head and kept walking. Daphne watched him go, her heart sinking deeper into despair. Minutes felt like hours. The wind grew colder, the city quieter. And just when she thought no one would ever stop, when she was certain that the world had turned completely blind, a car slowed near the corner. It was sleek, black, expensive. The headlights cut through the fog and stopped in front of her. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a tailored coat, his hair slightly tousled by the wind. He looked like someone who didn't belong in this kind of night, someone who lived in the warmth of glass towers and luxury. But there was something in his face, something that didn't fit the stereotype of wealth. Compassion. His name was Paul Bennett, 30 years old, successful beyond his years, owner of a tech company that had made him millions. Yet at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the small, trembling voice that reached his heart before his mind could form a thought. He knelt down in front of Daphne. "Hey," he said softly, his tone gentle but firm. "What's going on? Is she okay?" Daphne blinked, unsure if she was hallucinating. "She's sick," she whispered. "She's been coughing for days. I tried to get her to a clinic, but they wouldn't take us without money." Paul looked at the little girl. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. Without a word, he took off his coat and wrapped it around her. Daphne tried to protest. "No, you don't have to." But he cut her off. "She needs a hospital. Now." He carefully lifted Ellie into his arms. The child stirred slightly but didn't resist. Daphne's heart raced, part fear, part disbelief. "Wait, who are you? Where are you taking her?" "To help her," Paul said simply, his tone steady and calm. "You're coming too." Daphne hesitated for only a second before standing, clutching the thin blanket that had been around Ellie. The cold hit her skin like knives, but she didn't care. She followed him as he opened the car door, placing Ellie gently in the back seat. The warmth of the car was almost shocking. Daphne sat beside her daughter, rubbing her small hands as Paul got in and started the engine. For the first time in days, she felt heat, real heat, and the tears came without warning. Paul glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "We'll get her help," he said quietly. "I promise." She couldn't speak. She just nodded, staring at her daughter's face illuminated by the dashboard light. Ellie's breathing was weak but steady. The city lights passed by like a dream. Daphne's thoughts ran wild. Who was this man? Why did he stop? Was this real? People didn't stop for others anymore, especially not people like him. At the hospital, Paul jumped out first, calling for help. Within seconds, nurses rushed to them, taking Ellie into the emergency room. Daphne tried to follow, but one of the nurses stopped her. "Please wait here, ma'am." She sank into a chair, trembling, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Paul sat beside her, his presence oddly comforting. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daphne whispered, Why did you help us?" Paul looked down at his hands. "Because I could, and because no one else did." Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't even know us." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "I didn't need to." The sound of footsteps broke the silence. A doctor approached them. "She's stable," he said with a kind smile. "It looks like pneumonia, but we got to her in time. She'll need to stay for a few days." Daphne exhaled sharply, covering her face with her hands. The weight she had carried for weeks lifted in an instant. She began to sob. Not from sadness, but from relief so powerful it hurt. Paul placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but reassuring. "She's going to be fine," he said softly. When Daphne looked up, she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a long time. Kindness without pity, care without judgment. And though she didn't know it yet, that moment, that single act of compassion from a stranger on a frozen street, was the beginning of something that would change all three of their lives forever. The sterile smell of the hospital hung in the air like an invisible reminder of fear and hope living side by side. Machines hummed quietly. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor pulsed softly in the room where little Ellie slept. She looked so small in that white hospital bed. Her cheeks pale but peaceful now, a faint pink returning to her lips as warmth and medicine began to do their work. Daphne sat by her side, her fingers intertwined with her daughter's tiny hand, afraid to let go. Every now and then, she would look up at the four-tube and whisper a silent prayer of gratitude. Not just to God, but to the man who had made this moment possible. Paul stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the city lights outside. His expensive coat hung over the chair, his tie loosened, his face tired but thoughtful. He had spent the whole night there, refusing to leave until the doctor said Ellie was out of danger. For someone used to making million-dollar deals, this was something new. A kind of helplessness that money couldn't control but compassion could ease. When the doctor finally entered, Daphne rose immediately. "Is she really going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The doctor smiled gently. "She's stable now. Her lungs were weak from exposure, but she's responding well. With rest and care, she'll make a full recovery." Daphne closed her eyes, whispering, "Thank God." She turned to Paul, her eyes glistening. "And thank you. I don't know what I would have done if—" Paul shook his head lightly. "You don't have to thank me, Daphne. Anyone would have done the same." But they both knew that wasn't true. She had begged dozens of people for help, and not one had stopped. Not one. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling. "No," she said softly. "Not anyone." Paul didn't know what to say. There was something about her, something that stirred something deep in him. Maybe it was the way she looked at her daughter, or the strength it took to keep going despite everything. Whatever it was, he couldn't walk away now. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. The morning light began to spill into the room, painting the walls gold. Ellie stirred and blinked, her eyes fluttering open. "Mommy?" she whispered weakly. Daphne leaned forward, tears immediately pooling in her eyes. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now." Ellie turned her head slightly and noticed Paul standing nearby. "Who's that man?" she asked, her voice small but curious. Daphne looked at him and smiled gently. "That's Mr. Paul. He helped us, baby. He's the reason you're here getting better." Ellie's little brow furrowed as she thought. Then she smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Paul." He smiled back, the warmth in her voice hitting him harder than he expected. "You're very welcome, Ellie, but you can just call me Paul." Something about that small exchange made the room feel lighter. For the first time in days, Daphne laughed softly. It wasn't a full laugh, more like a sigh of relief wrapped in gratitude, but it was beautiful. Paul felt something shift inside him. He had helped countless people through donations and charity events, but this was different. This wasn't a headline or a tax deduction. It was human, real. As the day went on, Daphne told him bits and pieces of her story. She had been working 2 jobs before Ellie got sick, one as a waitress at a diner, the other cleaning offices at night. Her ex had left before Ellie was even born. There were no family members to turn to, no safety net. When Ellie's fever got worse, she used the last of her savings for medicine that didn't work. Then the rent came due and they were out on the streets. Paul listened quietly. Every word felt like a blade of truth cutting through the illusion of his own life. The expensive car, the glass apartment, the people who smiled at him for his money but never looked past the surface. When she finished, Daphne looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to dump all that on you." Paul shook his head. "Don't be sorry. I'm the one who should be sorry, for every person who walked past you that night, for the world being what it is." She looked at him, surprised by his sincerity. "You're not like them, are you?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "I try not to be." That night, when the nurses asked Daphne to get some rest, she hesitated. "I can't leave her," she said. Paul stepped forward. "Then let me stay with her, just for a few hours. You can rest in the waiting area. I'll make sure she's okay." Her instinct was to refuse, to keep her guard up, but something about his voice felt safe. She nodded slowly. "All right, just for a little while." When Daphne stepped out, Paul sat down beside the hospital bed. Ellie stirred again, half awake. "Are you an angel?" she asked suddenly, her tiny voice echoing in the quiet room. Paul smiled softly. "No, I'm not an angel." Ellie blinked sleepily. "You look like one." He laughed quietly. "If I were an angel, I think I'd be better at knowing what to do next." She frowned, fighting to keep her eyes open. "You already did. You helped Mommy." Paul looked down, his throat tightening. "Yeah," he whispered. "I guess I did." When Daphne returned later, she found him still there, sitting silently, watching over her daughter as if she were his own. Something inside her softened. She had spent years learning not to trust anyone. But this man, this stranger, had done more for her and Ellie in one night than anyone else in her entire life. Days passed. Ellie got stronger. Her cheeks regained color, her laughter returned, and she started drawing pictures on hospital paper. One of her, her mom, and a tall man with a big coat. Daphne smiled when she saw it. "Who's that?" Ellie giggled. "That's Mr. Paul. He saved us." Paul laughed from across the room. "I don't know about saved, but I'll take it." It became a small routine. Every morning, Paul stopped by the hospital before heading to his office. He brought fresh breakfast, coffee for Daphne, and flowers for Ellie. He didn't do it for thanks. He did it because it felt right, because somehow their company felt more meaningful than the board meetings and phone calls that filled his days. When Ellie was finally well enough to leave, the doctor handed Daphne the release papers. "She's free to go," he said, smiling. But Daphne's smile faltered. "Go where?" she murmured. Paul noticed the fear behind her eyes. He hesitated, then said softly, "You can stay at my guest house. It's warm, safe, just until you get back on your feet." Daphne froze. I can't accept that. You've already done too much." Paul met her gaze. "It's not charity, Daphne. It's kindness. There's a difference." She looked down, her pride battling her desperation. Finally, she whispered, "All right, Just for a little while. He smiled. That's all I ask. As they walked out of the hospital together, Ellie holding both their hands, the city seemed softer, the cold less cruel. Daphne looked up at Paul and said quietly, I don't know how to repay you. He glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. Maybe you already have. She frowned slightly. How? By reminding me what it means to be human. For the first time in years, Daphne didn't feel invisible. For the first time, someone had looked at her, really looked, and seen more than a struggling mother. And for Paul, it wasn't just about helping anymore. It was about them. What had begun as an act of compassion was slowly, quietly, becoming something far deeper. The next morning, Daphne woke up in a clean bed for the first time in months. The hospital room was small but bright, the sunlight filtering through the pale curtains, warming her face. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She only remembered the softness of the sheets, the quiet hum of the air conditioner, and the rhythmic beeping of the machines that monitored her daughter's heart. Then she turned and saw Ellie, sleeping peacefully, her small hands clutching a stuffed bear the nurse had given her. Daphne exhaled, tears welling in her eyes. Ellie looked healthier already, her cheeks no longer ghostly pale. She looked like the child she used to be, bright, curious, full of life. And that's when Daphne realized someone had made this miracle possible. A soft knock came at the door. It was Paul. He entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag. His smile was warm but cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether she'd accept his kindness. Good morning, he said softly. You looked like you could use this. She hesitated, then took the cup. You didn't have to do all this, mister. Paul, he interrupted gently. Just Paul. She nodded, awkward but grateful. Thank you, Paul. I don't know how to repay you. He sat down across from her. You don't have to repay me. Ellie's health, that's what matters. Silence settled between them, comfortable and strange at the same time. Daphne wanted to say something, anything, to express how much it meant to her. But her pride, that stubborn armor she'd built after years of being looked down upon, kept her quiet. Then Ellie stirred, opening her eyes. Mommy! Daphne rushed to her side. I'm here, sweetheart. Paul stood back, watching the moment quietly. The way Daphne's entire face softened when she looked at her daughter. The tenderness in her voice. He'd seen love before. The empty kind, polished and shallow. But this was something sacred. Later that afternoon, the doctor came in with good news. Ellie was responding well to treatment. She could be discharged in a few days. When they were alone again, Daphne turned to Paul. Why did you stop for us that night? He thought for a moment before answering. Because I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't. He looked out the window, remembering. I grew up watching my father ignore people like you, people who needed help. He always said, they made their choices. But I don't believe that. Sometimes life just happens to people. I couldn't walk past you knowing I could do something. Daphne looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a rich man, but a human being carrying his own quiet scars. I used to have a home, she confessed softly. A husband, a job. Everything was fine until one day it wasn't. He left. I lost the apartment. No one would hire a single mom with a child. It all fell apart so fast. Her voice cracked, and Paul's heart ached at the sound. He didn't speak, just listened. And in that moment, she realized how rare that was. People always judged, assumed, or pitted. No one ever simply listened. The days that followed were like a strange dream. Paul visited every morning, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with food. Ellie adored him instantly. She called him Mr. Paws because she couldn't pronounce Paul, and he laughed every time she said it. He read her stories, told her jokes, even brought a small box of crayons and paper so she could draw while resting in bed. And Daphne watched, amazed and confused. Why would a man like him, with all his wealth and comfort, spend so much time with people like them? One afternoon, while Ellie napped, Paul invited Daphne to walk outside with him. The hospital garden was peaceful, with blooming roses and a fountain that whispered in the background. You know, he said, glancing at her. You're stronger than you think. She shook her head. Strong? I've lost everything. He smiled faintly. And yet you're still standing, still fighting for her. That's strength. Daphne's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. Something gentle, fragile, and new. But she quickly looked away. She couldn't afford to dream. Not again. Still, that night, as she watched Ellie sleep, Daphne whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Not just for her daughter's health, but for the strange, kind man who had stepped into their lives. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope again. And that hope, faint as it was, began to light something deep inside her. A feeling she thought she'd buried forever. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for once, she was no longer afraid to walk it. Because maybe, just maybe, kindness could heal more than just a sick child. Maybe it could heal a broken heart too. Days turned into weeks, and by the time Ellie was strong enough to leave the hospital, something unexplainable had changed between Daphne and Paul. It wasn't spoken of, not directly, but it was there. In every shared glance, every small smile, every quiet moment when words felt unnecessary. Paul had offered to drive them home, though home was a complicated word. Daphne didn't really have one. She hesitated, clutching her daughter's hand as they walked out of the hospital doors, the crisp air brushing her face. Paul noticed her unease. You don't have anywhere to go, do you? He asked gently. Her lips pressed together. We'll manage. We always do. He looked at her, not with pity but with resolve. You shouldn't have to manage, Daphne. You and Ellie deserve better. Before she could protest, he said, I have a guest house on my property. It's small but comfortable. You could stay there until you get back on your feet. She froze. The offer was kind, too kind, and kindness always came with a price. Or at least that's what life had taught her. I can't accept that, she said quickly. You've already done more than enough. But Paul didn't back down. Then think of it as me renting it to you. No charity, just a fair exchange. Her eyes narrowed. For how much? He smiled softly. Let's say, 1 smile a day. She wanted to roll her eyes, but the corners of her lips betrayed her. You're impossible. And you're stubborn, he said with a chuckle. So we're even. That night, Daphne and Ellie moved into the small guest house behind Paul's mansion. It was cozy and warm, with soft blankets and a view of the city lights that shimmered through the window like stars. Ellie ran from room to room, squealing with joy, as if she just entered a fairy tale. Daphne stood silently by the door, her heart aching from gratitude and confusion. She didn't know how to feel. Every part of her wanted to trust Paul, to believe that goodness could exist without hidden intentions. But another part of her, the part that had been betrayed and broken, whispered to be careful. Paul, meanwhile, tried not to overwhelm her. He gave her space, never imposing, always kind. He would bring groceries sometimes or stop by with breakfast on weekends. Sometimes they'd talk late into the evening, after Ellie had fallen asleep, conversations about dreams, regrets, and the pieces of themselves they rarely showed to anyone. One night, as they sat by the porch under a blanket of stars, Daphne finally asked, Why do you do all this, Paul? For us. He took a long breath. Maybe because I see something in you I lost a long time ago. She frowned slightly. What's that? Faith, he said quietly. The kind that survives even when life gives you every reason to give up. His voice carried a weight she hadn't noticed before. He looked out into the night, eyes distant. My mother was like that. She used to help anyone who came to our door, no matter how little we had. My father hated it. He said kindness was weakness. She said it was the only thing that made life worth living. Daphne listened, the pain in his tone echoing her own. What happened to her? She died when I was 16, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After that, the house felt empty. My father buried himself in business, and I buried myself in work. Money was supposed to fix things, but it doesn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, real, and filled with unspoken understanding. Daphne looked at him, seeing not the rich man everyone else saw, but a boy who had lost his way in a world that confused wealth with worth. She reached out, gently placing her hand over his. "Your mother would be proud of you, Paul." He smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "You think so?" "I know so." For a moment, their hands lingered, just long enough for both of them to feel the warmth that neither had felt in years. Then Daphne pulled away, her heart pounding. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the conversation in her mind, the sincerity in his eyes, the way his voice softened when he talked about his mother, the way her own name sounded when he said it. She knew she was falling, not just for his kindness, but for the man behind it, and that terrified her. Love, for Daphne, had once been a promise that turned into pain. And yet here she was again, standing on the edge of something she couldn't name. The next morning, she found Ellie and Paul sitting on the porch, laughing together. He had brought her a small toy horse, and she was showing him how to make it gallop across the table. Daphne stood in the doorway watching them. It was such a simple scene, so ordinary, and yet it filled her chest with a strange ache of longing and peace. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't in years. Maybe family wasn't always about blood. Maybe it was about hearts that chose each other. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. For the first time in a long time, Daphne's life began to feel like it belonged to her again. Days were lighter. Ellie's laughter filled the small guest house, and even the silence between those moments was peaceful. The kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. Paul's presence had become a steady rhythm in their days. Unspoken, gentle, yet essential. He helped Ellie with her homework when Daphne was busy at her part-time job. He showed her how to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, always burning the first one and pretending it was on purpose just to make Ellie laugh. Sometimes he and Daphne would sit at the table afterward, coffee mugs in hand, talking about nothing and everything. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary. But to Daphne, it was extraordinary, because for years, life had been only about survival. And now, for the first time, it felt like living. But life, as she knew too well, had a way of testing happiness. Started one late afternoon. Daphne was walking home from the small cafe where she worked when her phone buzzed. It was Paul. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but tight. "Can you come by the office? There's something I need to talk to you about." Her stomach dropped. He never sounded like that. When she arrived, Paul's office felt colder than usual. His assistant avoided her gaze as she passed by. Paul was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city skyline. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. He turned slowly. "Daphne, I need to tell you something. There's a problem with the company." She blinked. "What kind of problem?" He exhaled deeply. "Someone's been stealing money, large sums, and it's been happening for months without me noticing." Her heart clenched. "Oh my God, Paul. I found out this morning," he said, voice low. "And the board is furious. They're blaming me for not catching it sooner. They've frozen some of my assets while they investigate." Daphne took a step closer. "You're saying you've lost your money?" "For now," he admitted, his eyes weary. "Maybe for good." The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. She didn't know what to say. For so long, Paul had been the one with all the answers, the one who had rescued her from the storm. And now he was the one drowning. Without thinking, she moved closer and took his hand. "Then I guess it's my turn," she said softly. He looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Your turn. To help you," she said. "You didn't hesitate when I needed you, Paul. So don't you dare push me away now." His throat tightened. "Daphne, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted, her voice firm. "But I want to. You showed me that kindness doesn't make you weak. Now let me show you that love doesn't either." He stared at her, speechless. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions. Just her hand, holding his, strong and sure. The days that followed were hard. Paul sold his car. He laid off half of his staff. The mansion that once seemed unshakable now felt empty. Yet Daphne stayed. She picked up extra shifts, cooked dinners, and filled the quiet house with warmth again. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, Paul would watch her from the doorway, hair tied loosely, humming softly to Ellie as she tucked her into bed. That sight alone gave him strength. But the outside world wasn't kind. The media caught wind of the scandal, painting Paul as a careless billionaire brought down by his own greed. Investors turned their backs. Friends vanished. One night, after reading yet another cruel headline, Paul slammed the laptop shut. "Maybe they're right," he muttered bitterly. "Maybe I deserved this." Daphne turned to him, eyes fierce. "Don't you dare say that." He looked up at her, broken. "I built everything I had from the ground up, and now it's gone. Who am I without it?" She walked over, cupping his face in her hands. "You're the man who carried a freezing child into a hospital in the middle of the night. You're the man who gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. That's who you are, Paul. And no amount of money can take that away." For a long moment, he just stared at her. At the woman who had once been lost and afraid, now standing before him with more strength than he'd ever seen in anyone. Something shifted in him that night. He stopped seeing the loss as an ending and started seeing it as a beginning. With Daphne's encouragement, he began rebuilding, not as a billionaire, but as a man who wanted to make a difference. He started a small foundation to help families struggling with homelessness, naming it Ellie's Hope. When Daphne found out, she was speechless. "You named it after her?" Paul smiled. "After both of you, because you reminded me that people matter more than profit." Life didn't magically become easy after that. There were still bills to pay, still uncertainty ahead. But they faced it together side by side. And somehow that made all the difference. Late one evening, as they stood outside watching Ellie chase fireflies in the garden, Paul turned to Daphne. "I used to think love was something you earned," he said quietly. "But now I know it's something you give." She smiled softly, her eyes shimmering in the glow of the porch light. "And sometimes," she whispered, "it's what saves you." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, like they had been meant to all along. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them faded. The noise, the worry, the pain. There was only peace. And in that silence, something beautiful bloomed. The kind of love that doesn't need words, because it's built on everything that's been said without them. Months passed. The air of winter was slowly giving way to the first whispers of spring, and with it came a quiet sense of renewal. The garden outside Paul's home, once bare and lifeless, now shimmered with hints of green. And inside that house, once so cold and echoing, laughter had become a daily melody. Daphne had taken a full-time position helping to manage Paul's new foundation. Her experience living on the streets had given her a voice of compassion and understanding that no degree could teach. People trusted her. They listened when she spoke because she didn't talk like someone reading from a book. She talked like someone who had survived. Paul, on the other hand, had found a new rhythm too. Gone were the endless business meetings, the soulless boardrooms, the constant noise of wealth and power. He spent his days helping families find homes, mentoring young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds, and spending his evenings with Daphne and Ellie, his new world, his real treasure. But life, even in peace, still had a way of testing what was real. One morning, Paul received an unexpected call. It was from a former business partner, the same man who had once turned his back on him. "Paul," the man said, his tone slick, "we've reviewed the investigation. Turns out you were right. It was your CFO who was stealing. We've recovered most of the money. The board wants you back. The company wants you back." Paul sat in silence, the words echoing like ghosts from another life. They wanted him back. The empire he had lost was his again. But as he hung up the phone and looked through the window, where Daphne was helping Ellie plant flowers in the garden, he felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. That night, as they sat at dinner, Daphne noticed his distant gaze. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. He hesitated. "They offered me my old job back." Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. "That's good news, isn't it?" He exhaled. "It should be, but I don't know if it is." She tilted her head. What do you mean? Paul leaned back in his chair. That life, it nearly destroyed me. The pressure, the greed, the loneliness. I thought I wanted success, but now I have this. You, Ellie, peace. And I'm scared that if I go back, I'll lose everything that really matters. Daphne reached across the table, taking his hand. Then maybe the question isn't what you'll lose, Paul. It's what you'll choose. Her words hit him like light through a storm. That night, Paul didn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching the faint glow of the city in the distance. The world he once ruled, now feeling like a stranger. And as dawn began to break, he finally understood. He didn't need to go back to who he was, because who he was now was enough. The next day, Paul called his former partner. I appreciate the offer, he said calmly, but I'm exactly where I need to be. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Weeks later, Paul gathered Daphne and Ellie in the living room. There's something I want to show you, he said, his eyes gleaming with quiet excitement. He handed Daphne a small envelope. Inside was a folded document. She read it once, and her breath caught. Paul, this is, he smiled, the deed to this house. It's in your name now, Daphne. She stared at him, stunned. Paul, I can't. Yes, you can, he said gently. You and Ellie made this place a home again. You brought life back into it. You brought life back into me. It's yours, both of yours. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't have to do this. He took her hand. I know, but I want to. At that moment, Ellie came running into the room, her tiny hands covered in paint. Mommy, look, I made us a family picture. She held up a messy, colorful drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Above them, in shaky childlike letters, she had written, Me, Mommy, and Paul. Paul felt something break open in his chest. A tenderness so pure it hurt. He crouched down and pulled her into his arms. It's beautiful, Ellie. Daphne knelt beside them, smiling through her tears. It really is. And then, without thinking, Paul looked at Daphne, really looked at her. You know, he said quietly, I used to think happiness was something you had to chase, but maybe it's something you build. Moment by moment, choice by choice. She smiled softly. You built this, Paul. We built this together. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then let's keep building. And there, in the gentle light of a life reborn, he kissed her. Not with urgency, but with gratitude. It was a promise, a beginning, a quiet vow whispered between 2 souls who had already lost everything and found what mattered most. Outside, Ellie laughed as the first spring rain began to fall, her small hands reaching for the drops. Daphne and Paul stood at the doorway, watching her, the world soft and golden around them. She turned to him and said, You know, if someone had told me months ago that a stranger would change our lives forever, I wouldn't have believed it. Paul smiled. Neither would I. And as they stood there, hand in hand, hearts whole at last, Daphne whispered, Maybe some storms don't come to destroy us. Maybe they come to clear the way. Paul looked at her, his voice gentle and certain. And maybe, he said, they lead us home. And for the first time, they both knew they were finally home.